It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, May 10th, 2024 in Los Angeles. He is Sam Park. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, I am John Ramey. Stories this week that we are covering. More than 100,000 people flee Rafah in Gaza as Israeli bombardment intensifies. But U.S. President Joe Biden borrows a move from Ronald Reagan, of all people, and pauses an arms shipment to Israel in an attempt to influence how the Israelis are prosecuting the war in Gaza. Also, Chinese President Xi Jinping tours Europe and is given cognac from French President Emmanuel Macron. Also, the African nation of Chad holds a presidential election after years of military rule. Sam Park, let us start with the Biden administration and the war in Gaza. The story broke this week, originally reported by Axios, but this is AP reporting. The United States paused a shipment of bombs to Israel. This actually occurred last week, but was reported in the middle of this week, as Israel was approaching a decision on launching a full-scale assault on the southern Gaza city of Rafah, which still has not begun in earnest. And the United States essentially has been trying to draw a red line around how this invasion will be conducted. The shipment of bombs was supposed to consist of 1,800 2,000-pound bombs and 1,700 500-pound bombs, according to the official who spoke on a condition of anonymity, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so originally, Israeli officials leaked this to Axios. U.S. officials didn't confirm it for a couple of days. U.S. officials also have said they intend to eventually give Israel every bit of what has been appropriated for arms support. But this is something Reagan did, I believe, in 1982. There's a New York Times article out about it. And I actually didn't know that until I had read it. But we see Biden inching towards a harder line as far as opposing how Israel is prosecuting this war, even as he says things like ironclad commitment to the safety of Israel during a Holocaust memorial speech this week.
That's right. And he also gave an interview on CNN with Aaron Burnett a couple of nights ago in Wisconsin that touched on a number of issues, by the way, not just this one. But he mentioned that the kind of munitions that are involved in this pause of shipments are exactly the kind that Israel has used already in the Gaza conflict that caused what Biden thought were disproportionate civilian casualties, which I think we can easily understand. If you're dropping 2,000-pound bombs in one of the world's most densely populated areas, it's difficult, I think, perhaps not impossible, but at least difficult for Israel to maintain that they're attempting to minimize the numbers of civilian casualties involved, which they always say they're trying to do. And as I've mentioned before, I think in their own minds, they do believe they're doing so. That's just a guess. I can't say. Obviously, I've never met any of these people. But again, a 2,000-pound bomb, that's a lot of bomb. Now, I think Israel and at least their military officials will say, we're using these bombs to destroy the tunnel network that runs, which is enormous, right? And runs all over underneath almost all of the Gaza Strip. But the problem, of course, is that the 2,000-pound bomb, in order to be able to reach far enough underground to destroy the tunnels, is going to just wreak massive damage on what's above the tunnels, and that includes people.
1 million people have fled to Rafah from other parts of Gaza. It is the southernmost part of Gaza, and so the furthest away from the border with Israel. And so right as tanks were just rolling into the city, Israeli tanks, is when the pause was announced. And you just get the feeling that after Blinken's visit a couple of weeks ago, couple of statements from other Biden administration officials, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said at a conference last weekend that the Biden administration had made it clear to Israel that the way Israel conducts an operation in Rafah will influence U.S. policy towards the Gaza war. So you get the sense that the Rafah campaign, which again is, as we understand from reporting, in like an intensifying bombardment situation right now, but it's not an all-out invasion from what I can tell from the reporting.
Also,
You
a
get
ground encirclement.
ground encirclement, so a siege.
Yes, something like
Uh,
that.
you get the sense that this may be where the Biden administration is prepared to break. Now, that's not to say that they won't, in a rhetorical sense, still talk about the ironclad guarantee for the security of the Israeli state and the Jewish people, but you do get a sense that this is where things could really fall out with the Netanyahu government.
Yes, and here and there you'll hear Biden administration officials stress that they have an ironclad commitment to the defense of Israel, right? For instance, Biden, in his interview with Aaron Burnett, mentioned that there's no idea of pausing any of the munitions required, for example, for the Iron Dome, the Israeli air defense system, which has been very effective. And again, it's difficult to see how 2,000-pound bombs are defensive weapons, right? Again, I suppose somebody could make a case that they are. I'm not a military person, but just as a layman, I think many people would find that difficult to understand. And that touches on a theme that I think bears mentioning explicitly here, which is that this is not just a military situation. This is a geopolitical problem. And I think the idea that it can be addressed strictly through military means is fanciful, frankly. And I think something on that same theme, something that's almost certainly going on behind the scenes, is that, as we'll recall from a few weeks ago, when Iran launched its large aerial attack on Israel, some of the nations that defended or helped defend Israel from that attack were places like Jordan, which has a peace treaty with Israel and was on the direct flight path from Iran to Israel, and also Saudi Arabia, which does not have any treaty with Israel. They were a bit quieter about it, but they did let it be known that they had helped out. And so at some level, both of these nations, I'm 99% sure, have to be saying things like, we stuck our neck out for you. What are you going to do for us? Now, mind you, neither Jordan nor Saudi Arabia is a democracy, right? So they don't have to worry about getting voted out or anything like this. But that doesn't mean they're not subject to domestic political pressures, especially, I would say, Jordan, which has a very large Palestinian population, including, by the way, their queen.
What happens next? Does everybody just wait to see how horrific any potential additional action in Rafah is?
I think that is basically how things are going to work out. I think that it'll require some decision making on the part of the Israeli war cabinet. For example, I think there's some ambiguity, and I think that's intentional, as to whether or not the attack on Rafah has already begun. I think if you were to ask anybody in Rafah itself, they would say, "Oh yeah, it has."
Of course, it has.
Right?
Yeah,
And
right.
so, I mean, in some sense, this is a silly academic argument, right? Missiles are being launched against Rafah probably right now, and there's battles going on the periphery. Israel has seized what's called the Philadelphia Corridor, which is basically the southern border of the Gaza Strip against with Egypt, and so humanitarian aid can't be going in through the Rafah border crossing anymore, unless Israel allows it to, which at the moment I kind of don't think they're doing. And so, and I think it's interesting also that you brought up Ronald Reagan's decision to have a similar pause back in the 1980s.
Yeah, it was 1982, and I believe it was after a bombardment of Lebanon.
Yes, that's right. Reagan, much like Joe Biden today, by the way, was concerned with the way the Israelis were then prosecuting their their involvement in the Lebanese civil war, which went on for many years after that. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, did not go well for Israel. And I think it's important to bear that in mind as well. that doesn't mean that things in Gaza are going to turn out as badly for Israel. But are we going to have to wait almost another 20 years to find out? I think Joe Biden would say, no, I really don't want to wait that long.
Right. Another 20 years and however many, potentially hundreds of thousands of people would have to die.
That's right. As you mentioned, 100,000 or so people have evacuated Rafah, but there's still more than 1 million there. And I think everybody agrees. The United Nations, aid workers, international observers of many different kinds, and NGOs and what have you. It will be a disaster if there's a full-scale ground incursion into Rafah. And it's already very bad, as we've mentioned.
And I just want to point out, when the United Nations says it could be a slaughter, or when various people say, this will be bad, or this is not a defense of Hamas. And I think there is a very insidious line of rhetoric from one element in the conversation surrounding this conflict, that anything apart from uncompromising total support of every single aspect of how Israel is prosecuting this war is somehow anti-Israeli. And I reject that. And I wish more people would be quick to kind of frontline their condemnation of Hamas, even as they criticize Israel. That's just how I hear it sometimes.
I understand that, and I agree with you. I should say, however, that Hamas themselves are not doing anything to help that situation, right? They've rejected any number of ceasefire deals. They've, refused to, release any of the hostages or hand over the bodies of what are by now almost certainly dead hostages. But as far as that goes, Israel insists that they have two goals, right? Which are eradicating Hamas and securing the return of the hostages. And I don't think you have to be all that, again, from a layman's point of view, it really does seem as though these two goals are not quite in sync with one another. The only way that Israel has secured the release of any substantial number of hostages is by agreeing to a ceasefire. Now, that doesn't mean they necessarily have to agree to this one or that one, right? If they don't think that they're up to their standards, but that's how you get the hostages. And the more 2,000-pound bombs, for example, that you drop on Gaza, the more likely it is that you're going to kill one of those hostages. And I think they know that. And so I believe that a lot of people in Israel, but itself, by the way, hostage families, they've been urging Netanyahu to take the ceasefire deal that Hamas has offered them, just to get their family members back, or at least get their bodies back. If you kill everybody in Hamas, you're going to kill the people who know where the bodies are. And so the hostage family members have been very careful about how they talk about this. They've not been very accusatory or strident in their criticism of the Netanyahu government, because I think they understand that were they to do so, it would actually act against their goal of getting their family members back. But they have been very insistent that they want a ceasefire to get their family members back. I should say, however, that there are some other hostage family members who say, no, just wipe out Hamas, right? We get it, right? We don't think our family members are alive anymore. And so we just want these people punished. And you know what? I mean, I can't say how I would feel any differently from them if it was my family member that was being held hostage.
This will certainly be something we keep an eye on next week, because, as you said, it started or is about to start, kind of depending on what you read and what you feel about this. So,
yes, it's sort of Schrodinger's Rafah offensive.
Right. Xi Jinping in Europe. Al Jazeera reports that President Xi Jinping, concluding a 5-day tour of Europe, Visiting France, Serbia, and Hungary, he touted Beijing's vision of a multipolar world, held talks on trade, investments, and Russia's war in Ukraine. I thought it was really interesting that he went to Hungary and Serbia and France, right? In Hungary, the president, Tomas Sulyak, and of course, the prime minister, Viktor Orban, rolled out the red carpet, according to Al Jazeera, for Xi. They received him with military honors at the Hungarian presidential palace. Similarly, very pro-Xi reception in Serbia. In France, where he spent 2 days, Macron pressed Xi to address Beijing's trade imbalances with the EU and tried to use his influence on Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine. So basically, Xi talked to one country that's firmly in the West, NATO, EU, US camp, and then went to two, or at least one definitely, and a second possibly fairly sycophantic nation towards China, even though both are in the EU.
Actually, no, Serbia is
oh, excuse me, Serbia's not, sorry, but
they are a
Hungary
candidate.
is. Yeah,
right. And you might think that they would be a little more circumspect.
That's actually, I meant to, yes, that surprised me. As a candidate nation, I was like, oh, they're being awfully friendly with somebody. The EU is certainly, is the EU adversarial with China at this point?
Yeah, I would say they are. Okay. For example, it wasn't just Macron that she met with in Paris, but also
Ursula
von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, was also there, and so they sort of ganged up on him. Now, you know, France is one of the two main nations of the EU, the other one, of course, being Germany, which, by the way, is where Ursula von der Leyen is from. But she was there, of course, not representing Germany, but representing the European Commission as a whole. And so, by the way, President von der Leyen, back in the fall, announced that the European Commission would be launching an investigation into sort of product dumping, and, you know, sort of along the same lines of the discussions that the Chinese have had with people like our Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and our Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, right? They're concerned that cheap Chinese solar panels and electric vehicles and batteries and the like are going to flood the European market. And in fact, the leading Chinese electric vehicle maker, BYD, is opening a factory in Hungary. That is inside the European Union. So this is the beginnings of China trying to enter the European auto market in a substantive way. And the EU is scared of this. That's the reason for this particular investigation that they're launching. And so they were sort of ganging up on Xi Jinping in Paris. So you could understand why he might want to, after that, go to a couple of different places where you'd get a much friendlier reception. And China is investing enormous amounts of money in both Hungary and Serbia.
Yeah, they're both part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or they have Belt and Road Initiative investments there.
Yeah, and not just a little, by the way. They've got enormous amounts of money flowing in there. At the same time, though, as you say, Hungary is in the European Union and Serbia is a candidate. But these are both very small nations. Sure. I think part of the reason that Xi wanted to go to Serbia, and I'm sure you saw these reports also, was that his arrival coincided with the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade back in the 1990s, and I guess 1999, obviously. And this is something that, you know, was covered in the United States when it happened, obviously, but who, you know, very few people here remember that, right? It does.
I hadn't, frankly, until
but people in China do, right? And they have insisted for 25 years, ever since, that the United States bombed their embassy on purpose. I don't think that's true, but this is something that they carry around with them. And there are lots of things like this that people in the United States seem to conveniently forget about, and people in other countries don't. And I think we can understand that, right? If China had bombed our embassy someplace, it
We'd
would
never hear
be
the end of it.
we'd never hear the end of it, right? And so you'd never hear the end of it from the Chinese either.
So you mentioned the timing with the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia. It's also, so this whole trip was kind of lined up on along timelines. I read in Al Jazeera reporting it was the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and France.
Yes.
And the 75th anniversary of relations between China and Hungary.
That's right.
It's kind of crazy to think like how closed off China was within many people's lifetimes to where they are now in their global engagement.
For instance, the recognition from Hungary was pretty much automatic at the establishment of the People's Republic, and they were in the Soviet communist bloc, right? The recognition from the French government of Charles de Gaulle, I think, was more interesting, and I hadn't known about that, frankly, until this visit by Xi. But I just found it interesting that France beat the United States to the punch.
Right, that's 64 versus Nixon in 72, right?
That's right. And so I just found that interesting. And Charles de Gaulle, of all people, right?
Yeah, no friend of the communist.
No. And so and it sort of reinforces his image as being a far-sighted world leader, I think, just from a historical perspective, which you and I find interesting, John, perhaps more than some other people do.
I also found interesting that Xi, when he was in France and getting ganged up on, basically didn't give an inch and was rewarded with cognac. Xi feels like a pretty shrewd operator.
I think so. And I think at some point, perhaps next week, but at some point we're going to want to talk in more detail about what he might be thinking, which is difficult to kind of parse out because they have, of course, a very opaque system in the Chinese Communist Party. But I think, especially as involves electric vehicles, but that's for a different time.
I will say, and now that we've been doing this a while, and I see Xi in media quite a bit, he is very carefully curated, kind of for lack of a better term, a happy warrior or a warm and cuddly kind of projected image to the West, right? He's always smiling and drinking wine and showing Joe Biden his limousine, right? For somebody who is the authoritarian inclined leader of an increasingly adversarial superpower, it's not the stern gaze of Stalin down watching the tanks roll by. I mean, I guess these are foreign visits, but I do note like they're giving him cognac, and I did try to find out what kind of cognac because here on
Did you find out?
No, I did not. Here on Working for Crusoe, we are 2 for 2 in cognac enthusiasts.
But I think that's very interesting. For example,
you see what I mean, though? He's always smiling and cheersing people.
Yes, I think that, for example, when Macron himself first became president, he, I think, somewhat ill-advisedly let it be known that he considered that the French presidency should be what he called a Jupiterian office, right? That, named not so much for the planet as for the god, the Roman king of the gods, right? This sort of august, large, but remote presence that sort of hovers above everything, right? And he leaves it to his subordinates to sort of be the bad cop, essentially. And that's, I think, much more how Xi himself operates, by the way. For example, if were an actual Jupiterian presence in your own government, you wouldn't say so, right? You wouldn't actually talk about it, right? Just saying that kind of diminishes that aura for you, right? And so it's just like, okay, you're not doing such a good job with that, Manny. But
God, what a nerd to actually use that term. I mean, it's great, right? Exactly, we get it. You got a classical education.
Right, but Xi actually does pull that off. For example, when Xi meets Biden, everything's great, right? In the Chinese media, it's fantastic, right? It's just, but when Xi meets Biden's underlings, in the Chinese media, they don't mind saying that he'll let them have it, or have his underlings let them have it, right? And so all that sort of nitty gritty, dirty hands kind of thing. That's
Hardball.
left, that's left to the underlings. That's not something that Xi, needs to concern himself with, right? He's more concerned with the big picture of the national destiny of China in
Anything else?
the Chinese telling, of course.
Of course. Yeah. No, he's projecting, right?
Yes, exactly.
Anything else you want to reflect on, or
Not
shall we
especially. I mean,
turn to Chad?
obviously, relations between China and the West are, something we're going to need to keep an eye on. I would mention, however, just one or two other things, is that
Sure.
this was Xi's first trip to Europe in
Yeah.
5 years,
Yeah.
right? And Europe was long said to be the ultimate target of the Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. And so you'd think that if this was something that was a priority for you, you might have wanted to come by once in a while. Obviously, there was a pandemic. Xi also, I would say, doesn't travel a lot.
Fair enough.
And I wonder if he might be something of a germaphobe, but it might be more of the Jupiterian type deal, right? Where he leaves it to other people. But I also noticed that while he was in, I believe it was Serbia, he missed the presidential inauguration ceremonies for supposedly his best friend, Vladimir Putin. Now, I should say that world leaders don't routinely attend each other's inaugurations. That's generally more of a domestic affair, right? So it's not like you're going to see lots of people at the presidential inauguration here next year, whoever wins, right? That is, you won't see a lot of other world leaders. But once in a while, it does happen. And you would think if there was any inauguration that Xi would make a point of attending, it would be Vladimir Putin's, right? But it's like, oh, sorry, man, I can't make it. I'm in Belgrade that day. I mean, it seems a little weird. But again, it's not like a major omission, so I don't think we should make too big a deal out of it. I just found it remarkable.
Okay, Chad had an election after years of military rule. Chad is an African nation of 19 million people. It ranks second lowest on the Human Development Index. It is one of the poorest places on earth. Their GDP is 145th. The GDP per capita, this is annual per person productivity. This is an astonishing number, $702 per person annually in 2023. Since 2003, crude oil has become the country's primary source of export earnings. This is from Wikipedia, superseding the traditional cotton industry. So just to kind of give you an overview of this country that has been run by a dictatorship and had an election this week. And as it turns out, the military ruler, Mahamat Debi, is the winner. That means that the Debi family's 34-year rule will continue. He had been kind of the interim leader. His closest rival, the prime minister, whose last name is Masra and whose first name is French, and I will let Sam attempt to pronunciation.
No, that's quite all right. Just go on with that.
Yeah, Masra. He won 18.5%, while Debi won 61%. Masra, the loser, had earlier declared he had won a resounding victory in the first round of voting and that the victory had been stolen from the people. Nobody seems to think this was a free and fair election outside of the ruling party and government in Chad. So, they had an election, Sam, but all it really did was quote unquote solidify the grip on power of the Debi family that has been in power for 34 years. It's not a great story.
No, I mean, as we've talked about on this show many times, this year we'll see elections in many, many countries. And some of these elections are fine. Some of them are not so good. The elections in Chad stink. All right. These are terrible elections. But
it's a farce, right?
I mean, but for instance, John, you probably saw, and I know I saw, very little news coverage of these elections. And there's a reason for that, because nobody, and I mean nobody, in the international community is going to kick up a fuss about these elections whatsoever. And the reason for that is because they want Chad to be a stable country.
Keep that
And
oil flowing.
well, not so much that, because I don't think Chad is all that big an oil producer. It's their main export.
Oh, you're
right?
talking geography. The map will be up.
Yeah.
See who the neighbors of Chad are.
That's right. And that, I think, is the main issue here, because Chad, to their west, you'll find Niger, in which the democratically elected government was toppled by a coup. I guess it was last year, right? To the east, you'll find Sudan, which is still in the midst of a horrifying civil war, including a genocide. And in fact, Chad has accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees from that conflict. If Chad were to fall or become destabilized, it would be an almost continent-wide belt of instability almost from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Red Sea in the east. And nobody wants to see that. So Chad is going to get a pass, sadly, much as the Democratic Republic of Congo to the south did earlier this year. And so it's a terrible story. And it's just another reason why more attention needs to be paid to the crisis in Sudan. I would add also that, as we've discussed many times on this show, we feel like we're in a Cold War footing against mainly China and Russia. And the war in Ukraine feels like it's the main theater of operations, or at least the hot theater. And in as much as Israel is an ally of the West and Iran, Israel's adversary, is allied with Russia and China, it can feel like the conflict going on in the Middle East right now is part of that Cold War framework also. I'm a bit uneasy with that construction, just because Israel and the Palestinians have been in conflict for many decades, long before this particular Cold War configuration came into being. So I'm not quite as comfortable with that construction. I should say, though, that actually the largest and most important theater of this Cold War is Africa, right? It's happening and particularly in the Sahel region, but not just there. And we've talked about it many times on this show, and here and there you'll see other news outlets that do talk about it, but nowhere near as much as they ought to, right? And by the way, in the African theater, the Russians are winning. They're going from strength to strength. It's not like they're a blowout or anything like this, but their influence in the African continent is growing by the day. And I don't think that's something we can afford to take our eyes away from. I think it's interesting also that in George Orwell's 1984, as you'll recall, Oceania was always at war with East Asia and allied with Eurasia against East Asia, or always the other way around, always allied with East Asia in their war against Eurasia. But in the book, the fighting was taking place mainly in Africa.
That's right.
Which I think was very prescient on Orwell's part. However, he did not seem to allow for the third possibility of East Asia and Eurasia allied against Oceania, which seems to be where we're at now. So, even a genius like George Orwell gets a couple things wrong here and there.
Well, it's been a very complicated 21st century.
Certainly,
when we think about Africa as kind of the biggest and most crucial theater in the new Cold War configuration, is that, again, because I need a 20th century example to understand it, does that mean it's kind of a hybrid of Southeast Asia and Latin America?
Something like that.
The old Cold War, from Cold War Classic.
Yes, especially because it's a developing world framework, right? As opposed to an advanced industrial economy framework. I think that's very apt.
Okay. Let's think about next week.
Okay. Well, Monday through Friday of next week, Mercedes-Benz auto workers at their plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, will be voting on whether or not to join the United Auto Workers.
Roll Tide.
Yeah. Now, the voting ends, I think, at 9:30 a.m. A week from today, Alabama time. So I kind of don't think we're going to get, and they don't start counting any of the votes until all the votes are cast. So I don't think we'll get results from that, unfortunately, by the time of next week's episode. The namesake of this podcast, Robinson Crusoe, was constrained by the perimeters of the desert island on which he was marooned. And much in the same way, John, you and I are constrained by events, right? Whatever crops up in the news in the areas of international relations or economics, we're going to do our best to cover it. But we decided to do that on our own. Robinson Crusoe did not. So at some point, I would like us to take an in-depth look, as I was saying earlier today, at the Chinese electric vehicle industry. I think a lot of people who tune into this program regularly will have heard us talk about it, and they've probably seen a few more news stories about it recently than they've been used to seeing in the past. And still, I would say that the implications of the Chinese electric vehicle industry aren't insufficiently discussed. So I think it would behoove us to try and rectify that situation, because it touches on everything. It's geopolitical, it's economic, it's international affairs, it's about climate change, which is still the most important issue facing humanity today. So, events permitting, perhaps next week, we can take a very detailed look at the Chinese electric vehicle industry.
Yeah, I guess if the Chinese had a runaway electric vehicle hit in the United States, that would really upset a lot of things.
We'll find out.
Wow.
Maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Keep those cards and letters coming. From Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Albuquerque, I am John Ramey. Have yourselves a fine weekend.
Thanks, folks.